So good afternoon. How's everyone doing? Good. All right, well, hopefully you're not going to get all postprandial on me, being after lunch. So I'm going to spend the next 25 to 30 minutes speaking to you about opportunities for telehealth, specifically from the lens of an educator. So, like several of my colleagues here, I'm from Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. By training, I'm an emergency medicine physician. I'm an associate professor in emergency medicine. In the department, I'm the vice chair for education and director of our medical education fellowship. In the medical school, I'm the assistant dean for faculty and professional development. And in the hospital, I'm the director for the in situ simulation program. So that's sort of what I do at Jefferson. Any questions about those roles? Because a lot of these roles will come up in my talk, I promise you. So a lot of people tweet, probably more than they should, but I do as well, and that's my Twitter handle up there. So I tweet a lot of the content that I'll be speaking about. So if you're interested, go ahead and follow me on Twitter. Always like getting more Twitter followers. I think it's important here to talk about financial disclosures. I don't have any financial disclosures to report, but what I will report is my background. So previously to joining Jefferson about 3 years ago, I lived in New York, born and raised New Yorker. Aside from doing emergency medicine, I was hired by Mike Bloomberg, our mayor at the time, to put together a simulation for a simulation center for the New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation. How many of you are from New York? Great. So we have 11 public hospitals, the largest public hospital system in the country. And what he wanted to do is put together a simulation center, not for academic medical centers because they had their own and their own training, but he wanted a sim center that would really help us deploy simulation to hospitals that didn't have the resources to academic centers. And that's where I learned about telehealth. That's where I learned about education, prompted me to go back to school, get a doctorate in education. That's what really showed me about the power of interprofessional education. And most of us are probably in the nascent stages of thinking about, all right, well, how do I develop a really sound, robust teleeducational program? And I think a lot of that rests here. So my role has been in faculty development and helping our faculty become better teachers, better researchers, better leaders. And a lot of the content, a lot of the life lessons that I've learned in simulation have been funneled into creating telehealth training opportunities at Jefferson. My overarching goal today is to simply change the shift of what we've been talking about all morning. This morning, from what I understand, has been very research heavy, yes? Which is great, and I think research is important, but my overarching goal is to get you to think a little bit more critically about how do you scaffold education around telehealth. How do you do that in the early stages? Of course, there's a lot of PDSA cycles, very similar to quality that, trickle into education, but it's important to think about these things early on in educational design. Does that make sense? So with that, I have 3 specific objectives. I want to introduce some theoretical frameworks that are going to help you think about educating and training your staff, your students, your residents, your personnel, in telehealth. I want to talk about a few examples about how this can be successfully integrated into an overarching organizational plan and academic curriculum. I'm going to cite some of our Jefferson initiatives here. And then I'm going to end by talking about a few fundamental organizational ingredients that you're going to need to have to ensure a successful telehealth program. I only have 25 to 30 minutes. I think these are 3 very smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timely goals, and we'll get through all of these together. So why are we all here? We have an interest. We want to be better. Maybe we want to be better researchers, better networkers, better educators. The bottom line here is that we want to think big. And what I'm going to get you to do is to think big around education. How many of you represent an academic medical center from a medical school? Nursing school? Allied health professions? Pharmacy? Anything else I may not have asked? Nonprofit? So what I've listed here are 3 staggered steps: UME, or undergraduate medical education, GME, graduate medical education, and CME, oftentimes called continuing medical education, or synonymous with faculty development. So while this is pretty exclusive to medical schools and medical training, I promise you this is transferable to nursing and any other health profession. So think about this. You have a student, progresses to resident or postgraduate trainee, to a professional, a staff member. What is the one fundamental thing that is intrinsic to being a student and or resident that is different from CME, different from being a faculty member? What's the one thing that comes to mind? And it's okay if you don't know, but I'm going to talk about this because this is my metaphor for education. It has to do with this: scaffolding, organization, structure. In UME, as medical students, we have classrooms, we have curricula, we have exams. As residents, we have residency programs, we have milestones we need to meet. What happens when we're done with that formal training? What happens when we're faculty members? We lose that scaffolding. And when we lose that scaffolding, what happens to a lot of our peers is that they plateau. And worse, they might fall off this plateau. So this is my analogy for faculty development, to make sure that we have a rigorous training program for our faculty and staff beyond, into their careers. Do you guys know where this is? So this is from a trip that I took in Hong Kong, and I was fascinated at their use of using bamboo as scaffolding. It's 1/10 the price of steel, it's flexible, it's strong, it's adaptable, it builds on an ancient tradition. So I really think that this is the best metaphor for faculty development, as I think education does all these things, if not better. Cheesy, but I really believe in that. So you're probably thinking about, all right, education, how does this apply to me? You need to design a curriculum, right? You have to have some sort of curriculum design and development in your program. You need to think about competencies and skills, and because if you don't know what these are, how are you going to build a program? Educational formats. How do you deliver this format? Is it asynchronous? Is it live? Is it simulation? How do you supervise your learners to make sure that they're progressing appropriately? How do you deliver this format? And what are your learners' preferences? So if you're probably thinking about this and going through your mind, okay, great, time for me to create a telehealth training program, I got to do all these things, you're probably thinking, oh boy, pretty overwhelming. Which is why this is my 3-step approach to how to allay some of your trepidations and anxieties and feeling of overwhelmed, and these tap into my objectives. So my first objective was talking about the theory, and that's what I'm going to get into here. And I put a little smiley face here because every time I think theory, I kind of get a little stressed out, and some of my colleagues in the room laugh at me. But I'm going to make this really simple because this theoretical framework is going to give you a toolkit to put things together. How many of you, by show of hands in the room, are adults? I never raised my hand for this question, but the truth is, as adults, we learn differently than we did when we were in school, which is why you cannot sit in a classroom from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. without zoning out, drifting off, looking at your iPhone, thinking about what you want to do later on, because as adults, we learn differently. So this is essentially a schematic of all the cool educational theories out there that I promise you will tie into your telehealth training program, whether it's for students, residents, and faculty. And what I'm going to do for the next 10 to 15 minutes is I'm going to go over each and every single one of these theories to really capitalize. You guys don't want that? I figured that. So I took a little, funnel over here, and I put in all that crap, and I distilled it into my recipe of what telehealth education and what telehealth training needs to be all about. You need to think about principles. What are some principles about education that I need to know? Learning science. What specific learning science things do I need to know? Delivery. How do I, now that I've developed the most cool program ever, how do I get that out to the masses? So that's what we're going to do. Are we okay with this, or do you want me to revert back to my previous slide and go through all those theorists? Okay, I'll take that silence as a yes. So let's begin with principles. If you look at all these different theorists, they propose central tenets that all instructors need to abide by and understand that define the way adults learn effectively. You're probably scanning this list. Not all of these look like they're, relevant or congruent with a telehealth training program, but the ones in red are. So obviously you want a program that's self-directed, you want a program that's goal-oriented, you want something that's practical, something that gives the learner both medical and physical involvement, and something that they can practice and apply pretty readily. Done. Easy. Let's develop some online modules. Let's put this in a course with or without an assessment. Maybe there's a hands-on or a practical component with a graded level of difficulty where things get more and more challenging. Of course, there should be some immersive component to this, some immersive where they're immersed in a clinical experience, and maybe this fits along some longitudinal curriculum. Okay, I'm done. That's pretty much it. Not quite. Because there's some learning science here that's going to inform this little model. Now, I love Legos, and I think of all these little frameworks as Legos. And I'm going to guess that there are educators in the room. By show of hands, how many of you identify yourselves as educators? Okay, and I would argue that some of you probably have more educational experience than I do in putting telehealth training programs together. But what I want to do over the next couple of minutes is give you some of these theoretical frameworks and these perspectives as potential building blocks for curricular design, things that you should consider early, not later, after you roll out your program, and especially if you're in the nascent stages of putting together a telehealth program. Because if you start thinking about these things a little bit too late, it's too late. How many of you are familiar with the Dreyfus model? Some? Okay, I'm not going to ask you guys to interpret it, but this is something that puts something that's very common sense into very tangible terms. And I'm a very simple thinker, and this is great. So it breaks things down into a y-axis and an x-axis. And here's a curve. And learners are going to live somewhere along this curve, from novice to advanced beginner, to proficient, to expert, until they achieve mastery level. You hope that this is always asymptotic to, the expert, because no one really truly is an expert. And then this is sort of the thinking styles that they employ kind of on the y-axis. And you'd expect that as learners become more proficient, the rules that they would need, the scaffolding that they would need, the order that they would need are going to decrease over time. So again, this puts into graphical format something that we sort of know, but this is great for faculty development, for your instructional designers to discuss when you're putting together a program. So what teaching methods improve retention? Show of hands, what do you think is up there in terms of retaining content that you're learning? Yeah. Repetition, I like that. What else? Practice, great. Experiential learning, and I heard the best answer somewhere over here. Teaching. Teaching. How many of you have seen this learning pyramid? I see this always on someone's slide deck every time I go to an educational conference. Have you seen this before? This basically says that, today I'm giving a PowerPoint, which is really sad because I did put some thought into, what I'm talking about today. You guys are only going to remember 5% of what I talk about today. But if we had a discussion, maybe you'll remember 50%. If you were practicing things, maybe you'd remember 75%. So when I first saw this slide, I thought, wow, this is so cool. Where is this research coming from? I need to meet the PI that put this together, and I want to collaborate with her or him. So all I found was this National Training Laboratories in Maine. There was never any study that validated this. So these numbers I have no idea where these came up of. Somebody just decided to put these numbers up. This is not true. However, what is true is my pyramid deconstructed. I hate things when there's no truth behind it, no validity, no reliability. So I broke it down and I created a brand new table. And what I've done is I dichotomize things into passive and active learning modalities. And there is literature, lots of it, to show that active modalities are ascribed to higher retention rates. Whether or not they ascribe to these numbers here and these statistics here is a completely different story. But we can all agree that these are probably more likely to engage in retention. And thinking about this is going to be quintessential when you're putting together your respective training program. Now we get into deliberate practice. This is one of my most favorite things. How many of you have read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers? Nice. Good. Do you guys remember the chapter where he talks about Anders Ericsson? So this is Anders Ericsson's brainchild. And deliberate practice means doing something over and over and over again through formative feedback. So somebody's watching you and giving you formative feedback, coaching you, so you can do what? Boom. Develop the muscle memory. Get to that mastery level. Get to that expertise level. When I explain this to people that never really heard about deliberate practice, I think of driving on a highway. How many of you, when you arrived here today, or maybe, before you arrived here today, went to a car rental agency to rent a car to get here? How many of you drove here? Keep those hands up. How many of you drove here for the first time? All right, I promise you, during your car ride, the radio probably wasn't blasting. You probably weren't having a conference call. You probably weren't texting, which, by the way, you shouldn't do. But you're probably paying attention to how many miles were passing between exits to make sure that you got off of your exit. Okay, great. Let's put that in the parking lot for a second. Now think about the way that you drive home from work after a long day. What does that look like? Somebody entertain me. You're listening to an audiobook. I like that. I think those are really efficient. What are you reading? What are you listening to, rather? Okay, cool. All right, we'll end that there. That's good. That's good. I like that. So, but you don't remember the trip, but you do remember this narrative that's playing in your head, right? Maybe you have the radio on. Maybe you're on the phone. You're probably making a mental checklist of all the stuff you have to do, what you're going to make for dinner. Maybe you're doing all of those things. So what you've done over time is you've taken something that's very cortical and you've downgraded it down to your basal ganglia that's automated. Do you think you driving home every day after work is deliberate practice? It's not. Deliberate practice is different. Deliberate practice is that critical process for you to develop the skills to get you to mastery level. So right now, I want you to think about this from the lens of being a telehealth educator. And Ericsson, again, his brainchild, did a lot of this work with surgeons. And he looked at surgeons to see how does one surgeon, and this goes into Atul Gawande's book, Better, also a great book, that talks about how does one get to expertise, master expert in the operating room. And it's not the hours spent of surgery that got you to that expert level. It was the number of hours spent in deliberate practice. So what does that mean? It's not about repetition. You need a coach, somebody that's watching you, somebody that's giving you feedback. You know what? You did a good job with that, but next time I want you to try X, Y, and Z. And you're doing that again and again and again, as opposed to repetition. Does that make sense? Because unless you got repetition, unless you get that deliberate practice, this is going to happen. Look what's going to happen. Yeah, you'll get better, but then you'll plateau. Or worse, you'll fall off that plateau. So maybe when we're driving, maybe you do need that backseated driver or that passenger, in the passenger seat that's making comments about your driving. Maybe that can give you some deliberate practice. And this is why we're always breaking Olympic records. Right? It's not just repetition. It's not just about going to the gym and doing laps all the time. It's about getting that formative feedback that makes you break that next level. So take-home points as this pertains to telehealth and creating a telehealth program. How do you integrate deliberate practice into that scheme? Well, observations are going to be important. Maybe you want to video record these because you want to debrief them, give some formative feedback in the process. Maybe you have a rubric and you're benchmarking their performance so they get more checkbox in that rubric. And the goal here is to get them to mastery level. So that's deliberate practice, and that's my analogy for deliberate practice. But you can't talk about deliberate practice without talking about just-in-time training, providing that training when somebody needs it most. How many of you have Epic at your hospitals? Okay, we just got Epic a couple of days ago. I've never used it. I was terrified. So what I did is I spoke to one of my colleagues, and she gave me a 15-minute crash course right before I went in. Deliberate practice. Any examples of how you use just-in-time training at your respective shops? So I'm going to use a non-telehealth example, but this is something that I do. When I'm in the emergency room and I have a patient that needs an airway, I need to secure their airway, and I have to put in a breathing tube to put them on a ventilator to make sure that they're protecting their airway. I have no idea what that skill set is for my learner. They're like, yeah, sure, Dr. P, I practiced that in the sim lab. When? 6 months ago. Great. And then we practice, and they're holding everything with the wrong hand, and it's just going to be chest pain. So what I do is I have one of these little simulators, and I bring it in from the closet, and they show me again and again, and I give them feedback until they've achieved that mastery level to go on and do that intubation. So applying this to telehealth, maybe this means we need to practice a little bit before a telehealth encounter. Maybe we need to leverage simulation if you have a simulation center at your shop. You know, it doesn't necessarily be a simulation. It could just be a discussion about logistics, anything that provides them immersion, anything that gives them feedback and coaching that allows for that deliberate practice right before they do the procedure, when minutes count most. And if you do that, you're going to get them to some muscle memory. So we spoke about principles. We spoke a little bit about learning science. Delivery should be short. How many of you know about active learning? Okay, so active learning, especially if you're in medical schools, you know a lot about the LCME. There are standards here that talk about we need to make our learners move from a state of, you know, passive learning to active learning. They need to be engaged, problem solve, critically think. I think telehealth is a great opportunity to dovetail with this and meet those LCME standards. We spoke a couple of these delivery methods, whether that's SIMS, observation and feedback, flipped classrooms. These are easy ways that you can start doing this. And the way that you want them to start doing this is if you get them to function at the highest level of the pyramid here for clinical competence, because if they perform that well here, then chances are they'll be able to perform that in real life unsupervised. So what am I saying here? Translation. I'm basically saying that there's a lot of educational paradigms out there. Don't be overwhelmed. You don't need to use them all. It really depends on what the goals and objectives of your program are. And you need to work with instructional designers who get this well and work with those instructional designers early. I said I would talk to you about some examples of telehealth education. I'm going to cite some examples in my shop, but before we get there, you know, we need to understand that changing landscape, that our students are getting younger, that our faculty are getting older, that learning environments are changing more than ever before, and that career changes are happening later in life. I mean, just look at this schematic for a second, right? Here are our baby boomer faculty members. Here are Generation Xers faculty members. And look at our students, right? The way that they learn is going to be different from the way that they teach. Huge incongruency. And these faculty members are going to require our support as change agents and champions of telehealth. Our learners are mixed, a combination of older and younger students. So we need to be cognizant of their preferences and cognizant of the science with which that they learn. Our students want technology, they want things to be engaging, they want real-world applications, they want to know why, they want things to be super cool. So telehealth is the perfect way to integrate a technology, something educational, that meets all of their preferences. Our faculty will have some problem because they're not accustomed to doing this. And that's where we need to step in and chaperone them and bridge the divide and overcome the obstacles that there are for educational design. So how do we do that? Targeted training programs for all trainees, students, faculty, and residents. Things that are student-centered, things that focus on learner outcomes and patient outcomes and competency outcomes, employing flexible teaching styles that integrate technology into the learning space. So some examples, so I'm from Jefferson. This is what we've done at Jefferson. We have programs that fall into 3 of these arms: students, residents, and staff and faculty. And the way we approach things is pretty standard. We look at our needs, we look at the programs that we're developing, we deliver the programs, we tweak them along the way, and we kind of go over this, you know, iterative cycle to make sure that we develop these well. What happens, however, is anything but linear. It's very circuitous. So the first thing we did was we got together a group of interprofessional educators, avoiding a very heavy, empty curriculum that spanned the entire spectrum of the journey, looking at competencies and associated skills that they would need. So what were them? So after 10 meetings, we were able to agree on a series of communication and interpersonal competencies. What are the competencies they need, and what are the skills that meet that competency? So we did that for communication and interpersonal competencies. We did that for training competencies to be able to train other people. We did that for healthcare knowledge competencies. Again, understanding that people are going to be walking in with different levels of healthcare knowledge, and technology competencies. And then we merged with with our Institute for Emerging Health Professions that helped us put together a program, a Telehealth Facilitator certificate program, one that contrasts telehealth and standard healthcare, but one that really defines the role of a telehealth facilitator, a new emerging health profession, very congruently fit into the Institute for Emerging Health Professions. And it is ATA approved. We created an online module format. We partnered with Digital Wave that created this virtual cloud. It's an iPad-based program where faculty, residents, and students can go in and understand these competencies. And the guise here is that we want this to be career enhancing. And if you look at our website, you can see all these testimonials of people that have done this, typically college grads now, that are part of this interprofessional team as a telehealth facilitator, that have a different role and a different skill set that they're bringing forward. So then we thought, great, let's bring this into UME. We developed a 1-month, 4-week elective for our students at Jefferson that exposes, educates, and trains them on the delivery and utility of telehealth and patient care. I spoke to several of you about the poster that we presented, but we even brought this into GME, graduate medical education, of integrating telehealth follow-up visits for those patients that presented to the emergency room that were ultimately discharged. I spoke about the LCME, which makes me cringe when I'm thinking about medical school education, but what's commensurate to that is the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, the ACGME, that talks about milestones. And look at this. Telehealth addresses a patient care milestone, performing a focus history and physical exam. Disposition, check. Patient-centered communication, check. Technology, check. What a great way to further develop those milestones in our program with this new technology that we're sort of primed with and that lives in our own backyard. So what we did is we got all the program directors in a room with resident champions. We spoke about various topics like supervision, how do we supervise these learners, developing use cases together, thinking about what that means for the resident. Do they get credentialed? Do they get some sort of certificate? And then having that communicate with new innovations where they can log in their procedures and log in their encounters, and that all is happening. And now there's an opportunity to further develop a new milestone with the ACGME. My colleagues for observation medicine created their very own. There's no reason why there should not be a telehealth milestone from the ACGME, and that's something that we're actively working on. Observation medicine, so if we had a patient in the ED that came in and we didn't want to discharge them yet, maybe they needed some time to improve. If they came in with abdominal pain, we didn't want to send them home with abdominal pain. Maybe they were getting an advanced image that we could expedite in the ED. That's true. It's not a discipline, but it still falls within the checklist of things that residents should be able to do. And because our specialty has evolved, there are more things that we're doing that they need to know how to do, that they will be expected to do when they graduate, that we are essentially responsible to train them on. So that means that as our specialty changes, we need to include those as milestones. And we did that for observation medicine. It's going to be time that we do that for telehealth as well. We have a non-ACGME fellowship that one of my colleagues in the back created that focuses on a 1-year professional development program from the lens of telehealth that allows a fellow to immerse him or herself into leadership skills and development, entrepreneurship, academia and research, and clinical experience. So we've essentially hit UME, GME, and faculty development. And lastly, I want to talk about some other additional considerations that we need to be mindful of on a higher level, on an organizational level. And this is a cheesy slide, but it really takes a village, right? Because unless you involve everyone, you're not going to achieve that organizational change that you need. It needs to come from the top. You need to create a culture of learning, a culture that creates opportunities for learning and pedagogy, one that rewards those faculty members and staff who are really taking things to the next level and addressing roadblocks that are linked to educational pitfalls. And we were very lucky because our stakeholders were really on board with this. A CEO, a president that loved the idea. That trickled down to our dean. He loved that idea. He created an associate dean for strategic health initiatives that has taken this home. Our designated institutional officer who runs all the GME programs was at the table, and that created further domino effects. And now we have curriculum committees that focus on this. You want to find your top educators and content experts because they're there. They may not be within your college, but they might be in other colleges in your academic medical centers, which is why this needs to be interprofessional. So you want to create this educational think tank alongside your instructional designers composed of education leaders, telehealth content experts, and you want to go outside your profession, outside your discipline and department, and outside your specialty, because the more diverse your committee, your think tank is, the better your educational program will be, I promise you. Interprofessionalism is huge. We're lucky to have a Center for Interprofessional Education, but if you don't, just invite other colleagues from other colleges to attend your steering committee meetings. If you have a simulation center, use it. This is a paper that I wrote recently that talks about telesimulation, about a paradigm shift for simulation education. And in there, I talk about the emerging need for using telesimulation, to help support the development of telehealth skills. Because right now, simulation in its own right is facing a challenge. We don't have faculty. We don't have resources. Telesimulation is going to be a way to save us, to make sure that our educational programs can be sustained in an age where our faculty are working their hardest. This is a quick little video clip. Do you want to just play this?
Guys, can you get him hooked up to the monitor, get IV access, get O2, get an AccuCheck for me?
All right, guys, did you hear all that? He wants access. He wants IV access, O2, and to be placed on monitor.
All right, we got it on. AC engaged, the right AC.
So our residents meet weekly. We run simulations with them. And now that we are having them do follow-up shifts, we are starting exposing them to various aspects where they can immerse themselves in providing telehealth in a variety of formats and a variety of cases. And that was just one example. Your institutions are going to have strengths and synergies that I don't even know. I mentioned our Institute for Emerging Health Professions. I mentioned our Center for Interprofessional Education. Team Steps. How many of you are familiar with Team Steps? You probably have this at your own institutions, developed by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, a framework for teamwork, originally developed by the Department of Defense, that focuses on bringing crew resource management skills into our clinical domains, that focuses on mutual support, situational monitoring, and communication. And you can leverage this training and communication that is under this umbrella of Team Steps to help pair whatever you're doing with telehealth and telehealth training. And then whatever technology you have at your institution, use it. We had this program called ICE, highly unlikely you'll have that one, but Blackboard, Articulate Software, Camtasia, Panopto, whatever you have, don't reinvent the wheel. No need to spend more money. Try to maximize what you already have in your own backyards. So my goals today really was to give you a toolbox of things that you can, use as you're thinking about designing your telehealth programs. Hopefully some of you have some ideas or some follow-up questions that I would love to answer. But my goal, again, was to get you guys to think a little bit more about scaffolding education around telehealth. We spoke about some frameworks. I cited some successful, sustainable examples, and I also itemized a few fundamental organizational ingredients that you're going to need to have a successful program. I'm really passionate about this stuff. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. That's my Twitter handle, and I think I went over. I'm so sorry.